Now, one of the most recent accusations of cultural appropriation was made by Marvel actor Simu Liu on the Canadian TV show Dragon's Den. On it, he criticized two Quebecois entrepreneurs for trying to disrupt and improve on the globally popular bubble tea.
Most of the cultural appropriation complaints you will heard is about the dominant culture appropriating a powerless people. So ethnicity over here has to be viewed in the colonial context.
Then there's a whole other issue, which is that who actually belongs to a culture, because the boundaries between culture vary and are quite fuzzy a lot of the time. People are exposed to more cultures and they want to take and borrow from them because they might see virtues, they might like cultures for different reasons, but it's the boundaries really of borrowing.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. How do you feel about bubble tea? Did you know that the popular drink originates from Taiwan? Well, not everyone does. And this fact was at the heart of a recent social media debate on cultural appropriation. To shed light on the complex and often heated debate on cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, we will be hearing from voices in the US, the UK, and here in Taiwan. Now, one of the most recent accusations of cultural appropriation was made by Marvel actor Simu Liu on the Canadian TV show Dragon's Den. On it, he criticized two Quebecois entrepreneurs for trying to disrupt and improve on the globally popular bubble tea. Now, the sweet drink, often served with chewy tapioca balls, originated in Taiwan some 4 decades ago and has since become an important part of the country's soft power. That's why many in the North American Asian diaspora shared Simu Liu's concerns. But here in Taiwan, opinions were divided.
我觉得这样算那个抄袭我们，就是模仿我们东西，但是没有提及台湾，这样对台湾没有尊重。
Definitely culture appropriation. 我应该是倾向欣赏这一边。
我觉得我应该是欣赏，文化欣赏。
欣赏吧，
我觉得会比较偏挪用啦，对，因为它是主要还是拿来盈利为主，对，然后它也没有在上面加注什么台湾什么。
他如果想要把台湾发扬光大其他地方啊，应该把提及台湾是珍珠是由台湾发明的。
我觉得对于文化挪用这件事，我是觉得还好。很多人可能喝了，那可能也会去思考说，为什么会有这东西，而去找到它的源头啊之类的。
The people pitching, kind of just making this business for money, profiting off of boba because it's so popular, but they're not giving appreciation to where boba actually originated from, which is in Taiwan.
我也觉得还不错，因为就是让大家就是更多人喝到珍珠奶茶，
大家越来越知道珍珠就好。
One voice agreeing with Simu Liu was Taiwanese-American entrepreneur Olivia Chen, the co-founder of a bubble tea brand, Twrl milk tea. Now, our reporter Izzy Wells asked her why she thought the entrepreneurs were culturally appropriating bubble tea.
So from my perspective, Pauline and I have been building Twrl milk tea since the pandemic. We started the company and, we are founders of heritage. And so for me, I came from a place of the dragons, they actually wanted to invest in a company that had a 3.7 billion, industry. There was such a big excitement about what they were doing and how they were disrupting the market. And I wanted to offer Simu an option. He turned them down because he wanted to see a company basically that looked and looked like us, who had founders of heritage, who actually understood the product, who cared about the packaging, who cared about the story and the origins. And that's really where I came from, that it did matter for me that, I'm at a helm of a company that cares about this topic deeply because it's really rooted in my DNA. And so that's where we came from it in terms of this cultural appropriation.
When we went to the streets in Taipei and we spoke to a few people about how they felt about this incident, a lot of Taiwanese people actually felt that it was appreciation and getting boba, drinking boba, having people drinking boba abroad was letting Taiwan reach other parts of the world as a form of soft power and kind of increasing awareness. And I don't know if you saw at the Paris 2024 Olympics, there was also, the athletes had the boba pin, which also had a viral moment. So where do you draw the line, between the kind of appreciation and appropriation?
I think it really goes back to your origin story. Do you have a connection to the product? Do you have a personal tie to a product? Do you have a reason why you're starting the product? And for us, we are founders of heritage. I'm Taiwanese American and Pauline is Chinese American. And I mentioned that, we started this because we grew up with this product. Boba moti was like water for us. It is still like water for us. And I think what we found in this situation is I've been encouraging everyone to focus on the positive outcomes, where you can focus on founders that look like us who are creating products in a thoughtful manner. And that is resonating with, all the millions of TikTokers and Instagrams and LinkedIn's and DMs. We've grown from 350 followers on TikTok to 7,900 in just a matter of days. It's a little bit insane. And it's because it resonates. The comments that we see are like, go girl, or you got this, we're behind you. This is a company I want to back. This is a company I want to see.
Some would also say it's been very, very beneficial to your business, while on the other hand, the entrepreneurs from Quebec have received backlash, death threats. How do you feel about that?
I think at the end of the day, I think that this situation, there's been a lot of change, there's been a lot of reflection, and that is the most important part to center the conversation on. I do not believe that there should be any death threats or anybody. I wish no ill will towards these business owners. At the end of the day, we are all wanting to have a better place for our kids. We're creating foods that are nourishing our souls, and this is really, I really truly believe that there can be positive outcomes from the energy that we're all feeling. And for my wish for the outcome is, to focus on founders of heritage, founders that are like myself, who are working on creating very thoughtful products that reflect our heritage.
That was Olivia Chen, co-founder of Twrl Milk Tea, speaking to us from California. For the full version of that interview, visit our YouTube channel or the TaiwanPlus website. So, in an era of globalization, when people and cultures are constantly intermingling, how do we define cultural appropriation? And where did this term come from? Our reporter Thomas Koper spoke with Associate Professor of Anthropology at National Tsinghua University, Hao-Li Lin, who is also a hip-hop musician. We asked him about the role ethnicity plays in cultural appropriation.
Cultural appropriation, I think, became an issue once, for example, colonialism started. So most of the cultural appropriation complaints you heard is about the dominant culture appropriating a powerless people, especially in circumstances that they were being colonized. So particularly indigenous people, their clothing, their cultural elements, even their ritual, their songs, ritual practices, for example. So ethnicity over here has to be viewed in the colonial context. And there's also the issue of neoliberalism when the meaning of a product can be stripped of its cultural meaning and became a commodity, a product.
Where do you think is the boundary between appreciation and appropriation when it comes to hip hop, which is or a culture really that emerged in a very, very specific socio-economic context?
Right. Hip hop, I think, is the perfect example. It is formed in New York City around the 1970s, 1973 to be exact. And it is often viewed as an African-American art form. And obviously sort of part of the Black culture movement. But if you look at the history of hip-hop culture, you will see that the pioneers are actually of Caribbean descent. Those DJs use Jamaican sound system and some of their technical elements for their DJ performances. You see breakdancing using elements from Hong Kong Kung Fu movies. You see those equipments being from Japan, technology, innovation. So hip hop under this light is actually multicultural, has a multicultural origin. And it's always been very flexible and remixing different elements. So as you know, when hip hop being globalized, spread to different worlds, being appropriated by the different youth cultures, I don't see there's a problem with that. And in different places, when they're practicing hip hop culture, whether it's rap music, DJ, breakdancing, graffiti, they're putting their, it is a craft. They're putting their time and effort into learning it, honing their craft. There's a key concept called sample in hip hop. So you're always paying homage to the origin. The connection is always there. The meaning is never stripped.
What happens when brands get on the bandwagon? Mm-hmm. So when I see a brand making sportswear and shoes, mm-hmm. putting hip hop music, mm-hmm. DJing, breakdancing front and center mm-hmm. in their ads, mm-hmm. is that appropriation?
Well, first of all, it has to be good music, of course. It has to make you nod your head. So you have to follow this. I think it's the hip hop aesthetics. It has to make you vibe. I think that's the most important thing. Secondly, like I said, the musicality of hip hop always has this connection, sampling old music or in the lyrics, paying respect to different rappers, MCs, often as the pioneers of this culture. So this connection will never be stripped. And if the brand using hip hop music is smart enough to notice this and keeping this connection intact, keeping the culture, the meaning in hip hop very well expressed, I don't see a problem of cultural appropriation here.
What if they lose that meaning? What if it's only aesthetic and nothing mm-hmm. else?
Then I don't think it's good music, and I don't think it can be criticized as cultural appropriation, because we can also say that they are appropriating, Hong Kong kung fu moves and styles, but we don't say that because we know that hip hop is very diverse in its origin.
Well, going back to boba tea, most people in Taiwan mm-hmm. didn't seem to mind that much the entire Canadian TV show controversy. What do you think of that? Should we listen to the culture that is being appropriated from, even mm-hmm. if someone else calls mm-hmm. out appropriation?
No, this is actually often the case. For example, wearing kimono, Japanese dresses, and being accused of cultural appropriation, but Japanese people don't mind it at all. I think in this particular case, people in a diaspora setting, like overseas setting, will be more sensitive to this kind of issue. And in Taiwan, back home in Taiwan, we are, in that sense, we are more culturally secured, and we don't find it offensive. But I can absolutely understand that in an overseas setting, for example, for a North American viewership, people of Taiwanese background or a Pan-Asian background will see it as an issue. So there's this difference.
What are some of the biggest, most egregious examples of cultural appropriation that come to your mind?
Well, obviously in the indigenous setting, traditional indigenous dances being borrowed in the name of promoting a national identity that happens very, very often in Taiwan. And those dances, songs have very deep cultural meaning. And particularly thinking about the indigenous people here are still under a colonial context. So those are the things I think cultural appropriation being understood as something that happens against the powerless people. I think that would be an issue. Although I wouldn't solely frame it as a cultural appropriation, but colonialism, I think, is probably a more appropriate frame to understand this kind of issue.
What would be a better way for Taiwan to sort of promote these elements of indigenous cultures without veering into appropriation?
Right. So first of all, there's the issue of cultural property right, that has recently become legalized. And secondly, informed consent. If you want to borrow or learn a cultural practice from the indigenous community, you have to seek consent, and there's a protocol and proper way to learn it. And if it is agreed to be taught and be shared with you, you have to do it in a very respectful and meaningful way. And I think those can be achieved.
Parts of Indian culture have also been at the center of cultural appropriation debates, from bindis and henna tattoos to the variations of yoga popping up across the world. Now, to give us some insight into cultural appropriation in the Indian context, we are joined by Rina Arya, head of the School of Arts at the Faculty of Arts, Cultures and Education at the University of Hull in the UK. Thank you very much for being part of the program. I want to start with your definition of cultural appropriation.
Yes, sure. So cultural appropriation happens when someone, so it could be an individual or a group, takes for their use something from a culture that they're not a member of, such as a symbol or an idea. And there's a power imbalance between the taker and the culture that's been taken from, with the latter having less power. So cultural appropriation refers to the impact that this has on culture, and that can involve harm of many different kinds, such as misrepresentation or economic losses. Some definitions are looser of cultural appropriation, in that, some people say that cultural appropriation is just about borrowing from another culture, but in my definition, I think what's really important is to stress the power imbalance within the relationship. So what is integral to cultural appropriation is the impact that on the other culture born out of the inequality of power that exists between the two. So the relatively less powerful culture might be a minority culture, such as, say, in the UK, Hindu culture. And the power can be described in terms of privilege, economic or otherwise. What cultural appropriation underscores is that taking from a culture that has power has political repercussions, because this culture has had to fight for their identity, where culture is core to their struggle and identity. So that's really, I think, a strong definition of cultural appropriation.
Right. So if we focus on Indian symbolism or Indian, let's say, chicken tikka masala, henna tattoos, as you mentioned, bindis, of all of that being appropriated, which we are now seeing almost everywhere in different variations, what would you say is the appeal of Indian culture in that context?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'd say the appeal is really the aesthetic, so like the colours and designs, and also the symbolism, much of which is spiritually laden. So one of the most popular points of exposure to Indian culture, to Hindu culture, was in the 1960s and 70s, when Westerners went to India to try and find themselves, really. It was kind of a new way of understanding the self, which differed from the traditions that, they'd been brought up with. So what we understand is, counterculture, really, in the 60s and 70s. So India remained a source of inspiration in the West. And so I think that's really where kind of it started from in a popular form.
You mentioned the whole idea of maybe the economic aspect of it, or perhaps not that culture particularly profiting or getting the economic benefits from it. Can you explain a little further from that when it comes to businesses taking on other cultures or other symbols from cultures?
So to give you an example, yoga has been hugely commodified. It's become a multi-billion-pound therapeutic business that's been used in various different ways. And whilst commodification is imperative in increasing the market value of something, it can lead to trivialization and reduction, and also economic losses to the culture in question, especially if their sort of intellectual property has not been recognized. But essentially it's often turning something that's sacred to a culture into something that has market value, and that's where we get harm of many different kinds seen in cultural appropriation.
Well, that kind of leads me to, in India itself, you see all kinds of Hindu symbolism used and all kinds of religious symbols used for commercial purposes, basically for aesthetics. And there isn't that credence given to the spirituality it is attached to. It's used purely on a commercial basis. And we're seeing that happen also in the West. And we don't see that pushback in India. So why should there be that pushback from those in the community that call it cultural appropriation?
So I think we see it in India now because of the rise of Hindu nationalism. So in India, the use of kind of Hindu symbols has become more stringent because of the way in which they're regarded now. So there is pushback in India. And I think within the diaspora, within various diaspora, there's pushback in the you get sort of community groups coming forward and saying, this is not how our symbols are seen, this is not how they should be used, that, you know, there needs to be more restrictions on the way in which symbols are thought about. And so communities often, there's backlash because they feel that their symbols aren't taken seriously, or that they're distorted, or even actually they might not be distorted, they might be used in, you know, arguably sort of respectful ways, but the point is that someone outside of the community is benefiting from the use of it. So that's also a consideration as well.
You know, there's an argument where historically it's been the case where the way to open people's minds to traditions and customs in a society that's not familiar or fearful of it has been to have that someone that or something that represents a crossover that will help them accept that, which will allow both sides to benefit, whether it's in tolerance or in business. How much water does that hold nowadays when we're looking at, particularly in India, or Indian symbols, Indian customs, traveling to the West and perhaps being brought to the public, not necessarily by a person of that culture?
I think, you know, what you're talking about, cultural exchange, is really important. I think a lot of people would agree that being able to experience and share other cultures is one of the richest parts of human experience. And we often get that, don't we, in many different ways through travel and the processes of globalization. So that exposure is a really big part of understanding different cultures. But I think it's the ways in which it's done and who... It's that question, isn't it, of who exercises the right to be able to do that, because it's not everyone's right. And then there's a whole other issue, which is that who actually belongs to a culture, because the boundaries between culture vary and are quite fuzzy a lot of the time. So I think that's, you know, a really good overview of why cultural appropriation keeps happening. People are exposed to more cultures, and they want to take and borrow from them because they might see virtues, they might like cultures for different reasons, but it's the boundaries really of borrowing.
So that leads me to my next question on, is there a point where a product gets so ubiquitous, or a part of a culture gets, you know, you find it everywhere, perhaps like the way we see Starbucks use espressos? We don't, you know, necessarily associate it now with Italian culture. Is there a point where that crossover happens and it's okay?
It's very difficult to pinpoint the origin of certain cultural products. And as they move around the globe, they change and transform. So that's an inevitable part of it. But I think it's really, when we're thinking about cultural appropriation, I come back to my earlier definition, which is about the relationship between the two cultures in question. When there's that imbalance and the culture in question is a minority culture that's being taken from, that's when it becomes really problematic.
Okay, if we want to push on that, when does appreciation become appropriation and vice versa?
I think what happens when individuals or groups are accused of cultural appropriation, I want to stress that it's often the case that no harm was actually intended. And in rationalizations, many people cite their interest and appreciation of the culture as being one of the reasons why they chose to use that culture in the first place. Thinking about the two terms together, we could say that it's possible to appreciate a culture without causing harm or distress, though. So, you know, for instance, you might listen to or watch Indian music, dance, theatre, film, religious practices and ritual at one remove. So not taking it for yourself. You can watch and experience something, but without using it yourself. That's a form of appreciation. If we go one step further and adopt these traditions or practices, that then runs the risk of cultural appropriation, especially if the traditions or practices involve something that's sacred to that particular group. So there's a fine line, isn't there? But what we can agree on is that there are more cut and dried cases where there's some cultures that are used in a superficial, gimmicky way with little regard for the value for members of that culture. And that's really where, we can call out some charges of cultural appropriation.
I grew up in a minority in another country where there wasn't much recognition of my Indian background, and then it was often seen as either exotic or the other extreme, where in a more unfavorable light. And whenever I saw people talk about Indian products or talk about Indian movies, it kind of gave me a sense of pride, and I was happy that it was going out into the diaspora. I think we live in a very different world now with globalization. So how has that changed the cultural appropriation conversation now?
Now there's a lot more protection involved. There's a lot more understanding about cultural rights from minority groups, a lot more kind of legislation about it. And the boundaries are more kind of stricter between, what you can and can't do. So I think that's how it's changed, aspects about intellectual property, heritage politics. So I think with globalization and the greater exposure that people have to different cultures, often through social media, it's likely to increase. The number of cases of cultural appropriation are likely to increase, and also the cultures being borrowed from. There might be kind of other cultures, new cultures, or cultures that are less known about. So I think it's always important to be mindful of the depth of cultural traditions, and to not just look at a culture in terms of its aesthetics. Consultation can be a part of that, so there's absolutely no reason why, if a designer, for example, wants to borrow from a culture, they can enter into, a discussion with the community or communities in question and ask whether it's okay to do that.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rina Arya, Head of the School of Arts at the University of Hull, speaking to us from the UK. Thank you. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.